A small child builds a tower from wooden blocks. It leans, falls, and scatters across the floor. For a second, the child looks stunned. Then, one hand reaches for a red block and begins again. This is not a clinical case, only an ordinary imagined scene, but it opens an unusual question. Is the child merely learning coordination, or are we watching a primitive rhythm of personality, a whole opening toward the world, losing its balance and returning in a changed form? Carl Jung gave psychology one of its richest images of human development, individuation, the long encounter between the conscious ego and a larger self. But Jung placed special weight on the second half of life, when the identity that built a career, a family, and a place in society can no longer answer every demand of the psyche. So why did Michael Fordham, one of the men entrusted with Jung's work in English, insist that the story begins much earlier? Why did an editor of Jung become a quiet revisionist of Jung? And can disturbance be part of growth without pretending that every wound is necessary? Fordham is one of the least recognizable faces in the history of analytical psychology, which is strange when you look at what he actually did. He met Jung, remained in contact with him, and corresponded with him over decades. In 1945, he was appointed a co-editor of the English collected works. He helped establish the Society of Analytical Psychology in London in 1946, where Jung became the first honorary president. Fordham shaped adult and child analytic training. He also became the first editor of the Journal of Analytical Psychology. In other words, this was not a distant critic throwing stones at a famous theory. Fordham helped build the institutions through which English-speaking clinicians encountered Jung. That makes the Block Tower more than a charming image. It becomes evidence in a trial of the teacher, although the charge must be stated carefully. Jung did not believe that childhood was empty, and he did not deny development before midlife. His psychology contains early complexes, family influences, archetypal patterns, and the gradual differentiation of consciousness. But his most famous account of individuation emphasizes a later and unusually conscious task. The person turns away from collective expectations and begins circling a psychic center larger than the ego. Fordham thought this left a developmental gap. If the self is the ordering wholeness of the personality, where was it while the infant was becoming a person? Did it arrive only when the adult became capable of dreams about mandalas, religious symbols, and the unlived life? Or had its activity been present before language? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for tidy schools of thought. Fordham had trained inside the Jungian world, but he also worked as a child psychiatrist and took seriously the British psychoanalytic attention to infancy, relationship, play, aggression, and dependence. He read Melanie Klein. He engaged a clinical culture shaped by figures such as Donald Winnicott and Wilfred Bion. Instead of protecting Jung from these influences, Fordham allowed them to put pressure on Jung's central concept. His answer was the primary self. The phrase can sound grander than it is. Fordham was not claiming that a baby possesses a wise inner guru or a fully formed adult personality. The primary self named an original psychosomatic whole, an embodied unity with tendencies and potentials, immature but already individual. The ego, the organized center of consciousness, would develop within this larger field. The infant was not a blank container waiting for adults to pour a personality into it. That claim changed the starting point. Jung's self was often imagined as a distant center discovered after the social ego had done its work. Fordham placed the self at the beginning as well as the end. Wholeness was not merely a prize waiting on the summit of middle age. It was also the condition from which development could begin. But a whole that never opens cannot develop. It would remain sealed. Fordham therefore described two linked movements, deintegration and reintegration. The first word is easy to mishear. Deintegration is not the same as disintegration. It does not automatically mean fracture, collapse, or illness. It names the way a living whole opens some part of itself toward an experience. Imagine an infant waking in hunger. A need interrupts the settled state. The child signals, reaches, receives a response, and enters a new sensory and emotional event. This encounter temporarily changes the infant's organization. Fordham called that opening a deintegrative movement. Later, the experience is taken back into the whole. The child settles, absorbs, and is no longer exactly the same organism that first awoke. That is reintegration. The Society of Analytical Psychology uses a simple analogy when explaining Fordham's model. An amoeba extends part of itself into its environment while remaining connected to the whole, then takes something in. The image is imperfect but useful. Development is not a sealed object becoming larger. It is a living system reaching out, meeting what is not itself, and incorporating the encounter. And now the quiet editor changes status. The man who helped arrange Jung's writings is no longer arranging the master's map. He is redrawing its starting point. Individuation becomes not only a dramatic confrontation in later life, but a basic rhythm of opening and return that operates from infancy onward. If you want the hidden arguments inside Jungian psychology, keep Beyond Jung close. Fordham is where the self stops being a distant summit and becomes a movement we can trace from the beginning. This revision has a subtle consequence. The environment matters profoundly, but the infant is not only a passive recipient of it. In Fordham's model, the developing person also brings tendencies, responses, and forms of initiative into the relationship. The encounter between child and caregiver is therefore unique in both directions. The child is shaped by relationship and also participates in shaping the relationship that develops around the child. That does not make an infant responsible for what adults do. It does not excuse neglect, turn suffering into destiny, or blame a child for a failed environment. It simply refuses to reduce the child to raw material. The distinction between deintegration and disintegration matters here. A person can become unsettled because something new has called an old organization into question. That opening may support growth. Disintegration is different. The organization fragments and its pieces no longer remain held within a workable relation to the whole. Fordham also distinguished these processes from splitting, in which parts become cut off or isolated. The words are technical, but the human difference is recognizable. Not every loss of balance is a catastrophe. And not every catastrophe should be romanticized as transformation. Consider a fictional adult example. A woman has worked in the same profession for 15 years. Her competence has become part of her identity. Then she encounters a kind of work that attracts her and threatens the person she knows how to be. For months, her old confidence is less available. She reads, experiments, makes embarrassing beginner's mistakes, and feels unusually exposed. It would be easy to describe the entire period as failure. Fordham's language permits another reading. A stable organization has opened toward an experience it cannot yet contain. If the encounter can be born and reflected upon, it may return as a reintegration, not a restoration of the former identity, but a changed whole that includes new capacities. This is an illustration, not a diagnosis. Fordham's model does not tell us from a distance whether a particular crisis is developmental, destructive, or both. It offers a question. Is the disturbance still connected to a larger process of engagement and return, or are parts of life becoming isolated and unlivable? That is more precise than the popular slogan that you must fall apart to become yourself. Some forms of collapse do not contain a secret upgrade. Some require protection, practical help, or clinical care. Fordham's useful distinction is not between comfortable people and brave people. It is between an opening that can remain related to the whole and a fragmentation that overwhelms that relation. The model also changes how we picture the ego. In some simplified Jungian storytelling, the ego is a shallow official who must eventually surrender to the mysterious self. Fordham made the relation more developmental. Early experiences contribute to the formation and consolidation of ego. The ego is not the enemy of wholeness. It is one of the structures through which wholeness can become conscious, negotiate reality, and survive contact with difference. This gives the child at the block tower a new significance. The collapse does not prove that deintegration is happening. We should not turn a theory into a mystical commentary on every gesture. But the sequence offers a clean image of the question: what allows a person to meet disruption, remain somehow connected, and build again without merely restoring the old arrangement? After minute 10, the expected revelation would be that Fordham defeated Jung. He did not. The more interesting revelation is that he refused to choose between loyalty and development. Fordham helped give Jung an English language architecture. His papers, preserved in the Wellcome collection, include decades of Jung correspondence and files on editing the collected works. Yet his child work brought suspicion within parts of the Jungian community. A later published conversation records that Emma Jung was supportive, while the wider interest in child analysis could meet resistance. The tension was not decorative. It exposed a question every intellectual tradition eventually faces. Is fidelity the accurate repetition of a teacher, or the willingness to test the teacher's concepts where they are weakest? Fordham chose the second kind. He did not simply make Jung younger by moving the same symbols into the nursery. He connected the Jungian self with close attention to early relationship, clinical observation, play, transference, and the inner world of children. He placed analytical psychology between traditions that often treated one another as rivals. From Jung, he retained a psyche with organizing patterns and a whole larger than conscious intention. From British psychoanalysis, he absorbed a relentless interest in what actually happens between developing people. That bridge is his status reversal. Fordham looked like a caretaker of Jung's legacy. He became one of the figures who prevented that legacy from hardening into an adult mythology detached from childhood. There are limits. The primary self is a historical analytic model, not a fact visible under a microscope. Deintegration and reintegration are interpretive concepts, not contemporary diagnostic categories. Infant research has developed far beyond the world in which Fordham wrote, and no parent should use his vocabulary as a scorecard for ordinary moments of feeding, sleep, frustration, or play. The model is most useful when it disciplines imagination rather than replacing evidence. It asks us to picture individuality without pretending the infant is independent, and relationship without pretending the infant is empty. It lets wholeness mean openness rather than perfection. If this changed where individuation begins for you, stay with me. Jung's heirs kept moving his ideas into places the original map barely named. We can now return to Jung with a fairer verdict. Jung described a crucial later life form of individuation, the conscious confrontation with neglected possibilities, collective identity, mortality, and the self. Fordham described a more basic developmental process moving through the whole lifespan. These ideas overlap, but they are not identical. One concerns the exceptional depth of a conscious task. The other names the recurring architecture by which a person becomes and keeps becoming. So perhaps the original question was wrong. We asked when the self appears. Fordham's better question is how a living whole opens without ceasing to be a whole. The child reaches for another block. The rebuilt tower will not reproduce the first one exactly. A red block that once sat at the bottom now rests near the top. Nothing in the image proves psychological theory. That restraint matters, but it leaves us with a specific question. In your own life, how do you tell the difference between an opening that is changing you and a fragmentation that is asking for protection? The child places the final block, then leaves one piece on the floor. The tower is complete enough to stand and incomplete enough to change. That may be Fordham's quiet correction to every picture of the self as a perfect, sealed monument. Wholeness is not the refusal of disturbance. It is the capacity to open, meet the world, and return differently organized.